Sid. He's the guy who wrote that extremely great biography of King Crimson, I can't remember the title of the book, but I'm sure you can, Marcus. And Sid's somebody I've known since, 1980 or so. We used to both frequent a place called Spectro Arts Workshop in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is, I guess, where I first started to fiddle with all these devices, VCS3s and tape recorders. I seem to recall when I first went in there in probably 1978. And when I started to think about Din, setting up Din, Sid and I hadn't seen each other for a few years. It's not like it is when you get to be an adult and family and work gets in the way. And I kind of phoned Sid up probably in 98 and said, hey, maybe we should go for a beer. I've got this idea. I didn't intend that to rhyme. I didn't know it. I'm a poet. Anyhow, we went down to the pub where we used to go when we were at Spectro, and I kind of talked about Din and how I wanted to set this record label and the kind of ideas I had. And I said, I need to, one of the things I would like to do is collaborate with other musicians. And there was a few names I already had, like Mark Shreve, who I'd worked with before. And Sid said, you should work with this guy called Markus Reuter. And I said, who? And he said, there's this young German guy playing touch guitar, and he obviously demonstrate. You also kind of do this kind of thing when you talk about touch guitar. And I said, okay, fine. And I think you sent over a CDR of some loops, your lovely ambient atmospheres. And I'm not exaggerating. The first one I put on, I loaded the file from the CDR, and I thought, what? This is fantastic. There was this wonderful, abstract, organic, beautiful soundscape. I'd never heard really anything quite like it. And actually that piece became A Beginning of Light, which was the first track of Distant Rituals. So basically, I think I then communicated with you, Marcus, and said, hi, I'm in Boddy, and this record label is going to come off. Would you want to do some work? And we said yes, and yeah, it was cool. It was easy to work with Marcus, and Distant Rituals, in fact, was Din 2, so it was the second release ever on Din. Did you come over? Did you come over as well to do some work on that project, Marcus? I'm trying to wrap my.
I did.
That must have been 98.
It must have been, yeah.
There must have been a 98 because the label launched in March of 99, and there was 3 releases came out all at once. There was Din 1, Box of Secrets, which was an album that I did, our album Distant Rituals, and Din 3, which was Strange Geography, which was much more of a spacey album by a duo called Protagonos. So I had the crazy thing of launching 3 albums all at the same time. So I would imagine.
I think it was. I met Sid on a Guitarcraft course in '98, and that was I think August, and then probably just a few weeks later, I sent you that CDR with those loops. Yeah.
Can I be rude and ask how old were you in '98 when you first sent these across?
I was 25.
Oh, you were just a bairn, as we say.
yeah. And you were an old man already.
Oh, of course. I've always been an old man.
No, so it must have been early '99 that I was at your place, and because we did record the solos for Distant Rituals.
Solos
at your place, and we did the mixing together.
Yes. And then that was the second album on Din. It's long sold out now, 1,000 CDs all gone, but it still stands up, I think. In that first, and it just has a nice little. I'm trying to think of the word here. On Distant Rituals, that opening track, A Beginning of Light. I don't know whether any of you guys can remember this or not. It's kind of like got an arc. It kind of just rises and rises and rises and then falls at the end like a nice shape. I like to give shape to tracks. About halfway through, this very strange loop comes in. It's kind of like slowed down. It's half speed, like a ka-chang, 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 like a very organic, metallic. And that's actually a tape loop from something that I did in Spectro in 1980 when Sid was at Spectro as well. I don't know why I chose that. I just kind of like one of these totally off at a tangent. That would sound cool over this loop kind of vibe. And the fact it was done all those years ago possibly before you even born, Marcus. Although probably not quite, but that was kind of cool.
Sorry. Yeah, 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 wonderful. And that was really, in a way, a mode of working that we then did not repeat, right? Like it was like from like the second album, Pure, I remember that I had prepared some. Well, we also did the album with Nigel before that, which was a live album, right?
That was slightly, yeah, that was slightly different. That was a live album,
Yeah.
and probably was pretty much driven by the tracks that Nigel and I prepared ahead of time, and you kind of played and improvised over the top. Pure, it was much more of a sequenced album, and when I mean sequence, I don't mean these kind of sequences. I mean you doing guitar parts, intricate guitar parts, layers of guitar parts, and then obviously I did soundscapes and textures and synthesizer parts over the top of that. So there was, yeah, that was a very different vibe to Distant Rituals, although still recognizably us, I think.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that we always try to kind of like change the approach slightly, and also try new things, new sounds, and kind of like this new sound worlds, and kind of like tied to the mode of working together. And I remember the previous album too, well, the Memento, which I think we I visited you, and I don't think
Yes.
we didn't have anything. We just started from scratch in your studio, right?
Yeah, I mean, we often work in slightly unusual scales or modes. I mean, Dervish is. Do you want to explain about Dervish? Because that was quite an interesting starting point. The Messiaen scales of limited transposition.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
It's like it's all symmetrical scales, different kinds of symmetrical scales, and like this composer Olivier Messiaen, he made this list basically, and so he has also numbers for these modes, and so
said,
like
I think there's mathematically only 7. If you imagine an octave on a keyboard, he made these scales so they were symmetrical, and mathematically, apparently, there's only 7.
Yes. Well, there's some people disagree about that, because if you use fewer notes, you can get more symmetrical combinations. But anyway, yeah, so that was it, like very conceptual, right? And kind of like much less intuitive than the work that we'd done before, in a way.
I think I came over and visit you when you were living in Innsbruck to help record that.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's probably the most prog, toward the prog kind of, it's not a normal, typical Din album in many respects. It kind of starts to head more toward, because we had Pat Mastelotto guesting on a couple of tracks on drums as well, which was quite nice. Well, it was more than quite nice. It was great.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just thinking, did we have any other guests? Well, we had Renee, my ex-wife, on that album as well, right?
We used her voice, I think, didn't we?
Yes. And Pat, and I think on all the other albums we did, it's only the two of us.
I'd have to think about that, but I think you're probably right.
And actually, on Pure, just kind of like interesting to me also, because like my relationship with Pat Mastelotto started with an album we did together called Tuner Totem, and it was kind of like the leftover material actually from the Pure record. I don't even know if you knew that, Ian.
No,
So, yeah.
You never told me that.
Yeah, and it's.
I'll forgive you.
Okay. Well, like one thing that is maybe important to mention also about like the friendship relationship, like the business relationship also, that in the late 90s, when you started Din and we started working together, that the music business had already, like the music business version 1, volume 1, it was already dying, right? So this whole idea of having your own label and having fair relationships with the artists, and like this idea that we split the income, right, after the expenses have been covered.
And the copyright remains of the artist. As a record label, I don't see that DIN should own the copyright. It's not. I just don't think it's fair. An artist's copyright should stay with them, and a record label has a job to earn income and earn income from the artist and for themselves. But I've never believed. I mean, I can kind of understand, these mega corporations why they'd want to do that, of course. But the size that DIN has, the size that DIN was and would probably ever get to, I didn't see it as a moral thing to own the copyright. So there's a kind of like a gentleman's agreement of not to do anything else with the music for maybe a year or so. But after that, if the artist wants to do something else, I just think it's fair enough.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you also have this concept of doing limited editions, right from the beginning.
Right? I mean, a lot of the plan that I came up with for DIN right at the beginning in those meetings in the pub with Sid, I've stuck to all the way through. One of them was limited editions, whereby there's pressings of, I think most of the DIN albums are, some are 500, some are 1,000, a couple have been 1,500, and a couple have been 2,000, and that's it. Once they're sold out, they're sold out. The artwork's always been very important, and certainly some of the newer designs with DIN. The covers, like this. The covers, the artwork is the cover. There's no text. There's no text on the front. And I've always wanted DIN to have a certain art style. Yes, the images kind of change a bit, but I've never been one for these kind of sci-fi or planets or spaceships and space kind of thing. Not that there's anything wrong with those, and I think that can be cool, but I've always wanted almost the covers really to be pieces of art, either paintings or photographs or a combination of the two. So if any of you ever have a look at, say, the Bandcamp page, you'll see a certain beauty, I think, in all the covers, how they look and interact. Also, this plan whereby every 10th album, there's one of these called an index sampler comes out. So it's a sampler album of the previous 9 discs. So, for example, DIN 10, Index 01, was a sampler of 1 to 9. Quite recently, there was DIN 60, which was a sampler of 51 to 59. And before very long, it'll be DIN 70. So I've stuck with that plan as well. I think it's either a combination of luck or good foresight. And I think people appreciate what you do when you have a plan like that. You're not darting all over the place. There's a certain consistency, and I think a lot of people, I hope anyhow, appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me a little bit about how the audience has changed and grown for DIN? As there, like, you probably still have like the core people around also now after over 20 years, right?
A bit of both. I mean, I don't think you can escape your musical heritage, nor should you try. I mean, I'm of a certain age where I grew up in the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s, so obviously the Tangerine Dream, Klaus Schulze, Vangelis, Ashra, Jean-Michel Jarre, these were all big influences for me. I can remember hearing Phaedra from Tangerine Dream in 1975 and was like, what is this? You literally hadn't heard of that style of music before. And of course, that got termed the Berlin School of Electronic Music, which kind of has come back into fashion in some ways. So of course, I come from that style of electronic music. And another reason I wanted to do DIN was I wanted to push beyond that, because some artists just seem to constantly do the same thing. And I've been doing music now for over 40 years, and I'm one of those musicians, I can't just do the same thing. I would get bored. And working with other musicians like yourself, Markus, always pushes me into other places and areas that maybe I wouldn't have gone to on my own. So I think there's a core audience to DIN who probably have the similar kind of musical heritage to what I do. But I think there's a lot of new people come on board. And certainly in the last few years, there's been a huge increase in modular synthesis, the whole tone science series that I've done. There's a new generation of composers and musicians out there who are doing all sorts of cool things. Different to what I do. My approach to modular is My approach to modular, for example, is always going to be tinged by those Berlin school colours, whereas some of these new musicians don't have that kind of heritage. And an interesting point I had with a recent interview was, I've just talked about Phaedra by Tangerine Dream, for example. The fact that I heard that when I was 15 is going to have a much bigger impact on me as a person than somebody now who hears it 30 or 40 years after it came out. Because at the time, there wasn't any reference points. It was like this, it was a truly new thing. And now there's lots of other reference points and it doesn't feel like a truly new thing. So as I said at the beginning of this answer to your question, you can't really escape your musical heritage, nor do I think you should try, because it's part of you.
Sure, I agree. And that's why I find that this more intuitive approach that we use for the new album was kind of like, even though we were forced, like we couldn't even if we had wanted to, we couldn't have met, right? But no. But so like going back to that initial idea, just Markus sends over some guitar loops, and then Ian starts building the tracks, and then Markus does overdubs, right? That's basically what we did. Right? It's quite straightforward.
I remember you sent me, we talked about doing a new collaboration, and I immediately said yes. You sent me over fairly quickly, maybe 10 loops. I think they were all in F, although there were different versions of F, F minor, F major, F weird, F really weird, and stuff like that. But they were all kind of in F. And I think for about 2 or 3 months, I sat on them. And every now and again, Markus would get in touch. You going to do something? I'm like, I just need a bit of time. You going to do something? I just need a bit of headspace. And suddenly, I got various workloads and projects out of the way, and I had a clear week. And I sat down and I put these loops on, and literally within the week, I put a shape to it all. It just was such a quick process. The inspiration needs headspace. It needs you to have the time to let these things breathe, to just think about what you're doing. And if you've got lots of other projects on the go, it sometimes gets in the way. And I think within a relatively short space of time, I'd created a shape to the album. And what I mean by that is, beautiful though they are, a continuous album of Markus's soundscapes is not what you and I want to do. Yeah. Obviously, there's my input, and then we build up on that. And quite a lot of what I do with Markus's loops is I've got some of the modular synthesizers, especially the Roland System 100M, which you can't quite see, it's just in the corner here, which I bought way back in 1982. The filters have a really nice sound, and I put Markus's stereo loops through two filters, and I kind of gate the filters, but in a syncopated way, not both at the same time. In fact, quite often what I do with this is I've got this sort of flip-flop gate, and what I mean by that, there's a certain pulse, and then this gate and this gate don't play at the same time, but it's a random tone cost. So it could go 1, 2, or it could go oops, and it's just so that gives a nice stereo syncopated feel to the rhythm. So there's a pulse there, but the actual rhythm itself has a semi randomness to it. And the two central sections, that's what I did. And then I sculpted other loops. We at the very beginning, I said to Markus, I want to do this on a vinyl record. And I want to do it where we use the vinyl format to what I think is its strong point. And you have to turn it over. One of the things you have to do with records, you have to get off your arse and go over and turn it over halfway through. So what I thought, and I don't say that as a bad thing. Why not? Why are we so pampered these days? We expect to have a remote control to do everything. So I quite like the idea of 2 continuous 20-minute suites, which perfectly fit on side A and side B. So I actually worked on the song as a complete 20-minute song. And I created 3 sections, but they were all segued together. And that's quite an unusual way of working. Normally you work on separate songs and then you might put them together afterwards. But I worked on the entire 20-minute slab of side A and side B at once. And once I had the shape, then I sent it to Markus. within a few days, I think from the replies I got, you were like, "Wow, you have done something with this. This is great. Let's continue."
Yes, yeah, and as you said, like what I sent you was all in F, because like the idea was just to send you material for one side of the album, but then as it turned out, you already had an idea for the second side, and I made the suggestion that you simply tune down the samples a half step or something, and I think that's why the second side is in E, not in F or something. I can't remember exactly now, but that's
yes.
what we did, just so that the two halves don't have the same root note, which
The scales are when you use scales and modes. So when you use modes of a scale, sometimes it often doesn't sound as though it's the same. It's all in F, because where the root, where the sort of where it feels like it's going to, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be F.
Mm-hmm.
If you
yeah, sure.
very well or not.
And that what I try to do is also like sometimes, and I think it's partly because like the way of working with analog sequencers and stuff, you sort of like it's much easier to kind of fall into the like a pentatonic scale, or like the diatonic scales and stuff like that. So like and I know it's easier to work with if you have something that fits in with that kind of approach. So I sent you like 80% that works in that field, and then I give you a couple or two or three pieces that sort of like extend the harmonic material there. And I was very pleased when you sent me the first compilation, let's say, the first track, that you had used like really very beautiful sections first of all, and then also there was like this beautiful harmonic movement that happened, even though it was the side one was all in F, right? But
I think the title track, Outland, is one of those more exotic scales.
yes,
Because it has a flavor. It kind of sounds restful, but at the same time, there's something slightly unsettling about some of the notes. It's the kind of, it sounds out of tune, but it's not kind of vibe.
yeah, I mean, yeah.
Technically, you technically probably know what scale that was, and perhaps you can. I don't know if you can remember what the scale was.
So it's not a scale. That's the thing. It's something that morphs, right? So it's like you go from one mode to the next, but the F is still the root note. And then when I overdubbed some more soloistic, like clean guitar tones on top of that later, I even kind of like started extending those harmonies as well by doing these, what like jazz people would call chromatic approach notes. So it is really very I kind of love that if something has like this really solid foundation, but then you can kind of like add the ornamentation, but not just with fiddly bits, but with actual harmonic and kind of like more dissonant tones that resolve into something consonant, right? And that's kind of like what we did there.
I think it's really great approach because the major and minor scales kind of sometimes trap people. There's literally an infinite number of things you can do with just those two scales, but using notes outside of a scale, which can often be a surprise. And I think you don't have to technically know about the musical side of this as a listener. It just gives a flavor. It gives a mood, and really, that's what you're trying to get over. I never see the technical side of these things as an end in themselves. It's not. It's not. It's as composers, you use whatever you're going to use. And it's the emotion of what this piece gives. And that the title track, has this slightly unsettling feel, even though at the same time it's quite restful. It's a strange, I'm going to use a big word, a dichotomy of, you're not quite sure. It's a restless kind of, and it also, we wanted the last track on the first side to really set the mood for what the first track of the second side was, which is a really claustrophobic, heavy, I think it came with the title Brood. It has that kind of claustrophobic kind of feel. So each of the 6 parts have a different feel, and there's certainly a journey from the beginning, and of course the last track with the beautiful last track, Home, kind of tells you where you've got to. The journey has come to an end, and you have got home, and that has a very pastoral, restful, peaceful feel, which I think is really one of the most beautiful things that we did. Yeah. I use this keyboard. I don't know if any of you guys know what the Ons Martin is. I'm sure some of you do. Maybe some of you don't, so I'll explain. The theremin was probably better known, the one where you wave your hands about, came out in 1927, 28, that kind of time period. And that has a very distinctive sound, the theremin. But a guy called Mr. Martineau, he did a keyboard at around about the same time, which has a similar kind of sound, but you do actually play a keyboard. The unusual thing is it's actually got a metal ring on a wire, which goes across the front, which you can move up and down, and that corresponds to the pitch. What it means, though, is what you can't do on a piano is it has gliss. You can smoothly glide the pitch from one note to the next. But the second part of the equation is the volume of the sound. There's a rocker switch on the left of the keyboard, and if you haven't got your hand on the rocker switch, there's no sound at all. Some of you may have heard of envelopes in synthesizers. This is how the volume starts, gets louder from the attack, goes on for a bit, and then decays away. And on a synthesizer, it's very much like a switch. You hit the key and the envelope opens the sound up and it stops. On the Ons Martineau, there's no envelope. Basically, you are the envelope. If I press slowly down on the rocker switch, the sound will slowly come in. If I suddenly take it off, it'll suddenly stop. If I do this, the sound will waver up and down. Then with the right hand, if I want to add vibrato, I'll literally waggle my finger. If I want fast vibrato, I'll do it faster. In other words, I've got total control of the intonation of the sound, which for a keyboard is a really unique thing. Keyboards don't normally have that amount of control. It's literally the same amount of control a string player would have. If you don't put your bow on the string and actually start the bow, you don't get a sound. And then the vibrato, you do this with the string. So it's a beautifully, beautifully, beautifully expressive instrument. Certainly the most expressive instrument I've ever learned to play. I'm a keyboard player, so that's what I play. And with Home, Markus had this. It was quite unusual with the loops. It wasn't really a loop like a soundscape loop. It was more of a jangly guitar chord kind of thing, but not the order of the chords wasn't just straightforward. This is 4 chords. I'm going to repeat the 4 chords. It kind of moved about, and then you loop that in the background. And I love that. And I literally sat down with the Ons Martineau keyboard. It's called the French Connection. And I played the solo in one take. It was one of those points in time which doesn't happen very, very often. Sometimes you have to sweat blood and tears over these things. But there was something about what you played, Mark. It's just I tried a second and third take, by the way. They were nowhere near as good. I didn't play any mistakes, which always helps. But I just followed what Markus played in my head, although I didn't quite follow what he played because I didn't actually know what he played. You have to do it by ear and by feel, and that was for me. And, I'm not the best keyboard player in the world. I never will be the best keyboard player in the world. But at that point in time, it didn't matter. I played with the emotion of how it made me feel, and that as an honesty, which I think comes across in the track.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And maybe it's important to point out that this kind of expressiveness is only possible really with an analog sound source, right? You wouldn't want to really do that with a digital synthesizer. The Ons Martineau is using CV, I guess, control voltage.
It's CV and gates. You can actually turn it to be a regular CV gate keyboard, and you can play it like a regular keyboard. You can even have the unusual combination of playing on the keyboard but actually still using the rocker switch. If any of you saw my performance at the SoundQuest festival that Steve Roach organised recently, there's a couple of points where I do that. And it's quite an unusual thing because I can play on the keyboard quite fast or slow, but the articulation's from the left hand, and that's quite an unusual combination. But in terms of the keyboard playing with that instrument on our album, it was all the regular Ons Martineau style. And it's to do... You probably can get that kind of expression from a digital source, although you have to use a physical controller. It's not necessarily the sound source, it's the controller, the instrument part of the instrument.
Yeah.
And of course, as a human being playing an instrument, it's your tactile feedback and response. And the more under control you have of that, the better.
Which synthesizer is it that makes that sound?
It's by a company called Analog Systems. It's called the French Connection. Radiohead, Johnny Greenwood and Radiohead, who use a lot of Ons Martinos in some of their more recent albums. He commissioned Analog Systems to actually build this because they didn't always have access to the real Ons Martinos, which are very fragile and difficult to move about. And he also already had some of the Analog Systems modular systems, so they actually made this keyboard, and they were so happy with it. They basically said to Johnny Greenwood, "Do you mind if we make a few more and sell these?" And he said, "Fine." And they're not cheap. They don't make a sound themselves, and there's not that many of them around. Certainly, the style of what I do, I've not actually come across anybody else who has one. And since I bought it in probably 2009 or so, it's kind of become a unique sound that I've got. I like that. I like the fact that I can play it and not really anybody else can do that or have that sound. I mean, the sound, I can get any sound I want because, of course, it can go into the modular synth and I can patch up the sound I want. But the way I play it from the Ons Martino gives me, or the Ons Martino keyboard controller gives me a huge amount of feel. It's not quite the same as the Ons Martino because if any of you know about it, as I said, the original Ons Martino, part of the sound is the weird speakers that come with it, one of which, the palm, looks like a beautiful shell and has resonator strings on it and has a really unique sound. It's been used in quite a lot of soundtracks, and it does have an eerie, outer space kind of weird sound. And our composer, who we were talking about before, Olivier Messiaen, of course, he used it on several classical pieces. I can never pronounce it. Is the how do you know the Turangular Symphony?
Turangular Symphony, I guess.
Which is extraordinary because he got an orchestra going full tilt, and in the background, or you hear this wing, wow, wing, electronic sound whizzing up and down. It's an extraordinary piece.
Yeah, yeah. I guess like one thing I would like to add here, Ian, is with our music, like we also pay a lot of attention to the individual sound, but also to the overtones of each individual sound. And so that's why talking about just the modes or just the drone or whatever is really only giving you one side of the picture. Like there's so much happening in the overtones, which really kind of like is super colorful. And I remember, like you were talking about the first track on Distant Rituals, which was based on this sort of like almost organ, like church organ sounding loop that I sent you, which is basically a pitch shifter, right? And right. It's just like historically interesting maybe that I have, since that time in the late 90s, I really stopped using pitch shifters because for some reason, the one that I used back then was like just kind of like a half analog pedal board, which still had this beautiful pitch shifter sound. But then in the early 2000s, the pitch shifters started sounding like really not good to me, and I stopped using them. And so for this for Outland, I actually got a plugin by Eventide, and I used that actually, like sort of like, I was thinking back, okay, let me try to do something not exactly like what I did back then, but let me just use pitch shifters again. And I think that really started out this album with a whole different kind of like overtone complexity kind of like that you then start working with. So Ian, why don't we just kind of like dive into the session and you kind of like maybe show the elements and sort of like, right?
Yes. Let me work how we do this again. So I've got to peer around my little camera here. Look at share. It's on.
And stereo sound is important.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay, can you tell me, is this all up on screen now?
It is, yes.
I'll just do a little test here to make sure you can hear it.
Yes, it's working.
Okay, so this is the first side. It's Ableton Live. You can see already there's quite a lot of stuff here. It's fairly straightforward, obvious that this is the first section over here, the middle section's over here, and the last section's over here. So the album opens with this. I'll put your loop on, Marcus. I apologise for this. I'm gonna. No, I can't see because the images of You Good Folk are on the right. I can't see my solo. How would our solo track?
There you go. Ian, your voice is gone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of the loop. It's a bit difficult without having the solo buttons. Is there any way that I can? Oh, actually, I can do that. I can drag the screen, can't I?
Yeah, you could also minimize the window, the other window, but it's okay. Let's do it this way. Hey Ian, while the music is playing, we can't hear you. There's something wrong with the microphone.
That's strange because it was working okay before, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Oh well, but that's the loop. I'll play it a little bit more. Just let this loop play for a bit so you guys can hear.
Can you turn it up a little bit?
So I put that loop down and I listened to it, and to me the first thing I could really hear was bass. There's no bass in the loop, of course, but it has a kind of it doesn't. Your loops often don't repeat in a what's the word? Predictable way, because you're obviously superimposing layers. There's a kind of repetition, but it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it comes back again. So I felt that bass was something I wanted to put down. So I think if I put on the bass as well, the Moog Voyager, and then play you how this sounded. Now, a little trick what I did here was, I've not got perfect pitch, but I can't just tell by hearing something like that what pitches Marcus has played. I do one or two things. I just get a regular keyboard, piano sound on Ableton Live, and I literally will play it, and I can hear which notes work. Oh, but also what I did for this was, I can't quite remember what the plugin's called, but you can get Ableton Live to analyze the audio, and it tells you what pitches is being played. Now, for something as complex as this, it's not very, it's not always spot on, but it's close enough, and I could see what notes were dominating for quite. It often puts little spurious, little tiny notes up which you can ignore, but the longer notes I could kind of tell. So I kind of used those as the basis of what I would play, knowing that as I was playing those bass notes, they were in keeping harmonically with what Marcus's loop was doing. Once I had the bass, then I added some pad sounds, and it already with the bass, it was starting to have a sort of a grand kind of feel. It had a kind of it just sounded big. It had this. The bass all automatically kind of does that, gives a solid foundation. And I added a couple of pad sounds. Let me just put these in. In fact, what I'll do is I'll take Markus's loop out and play the bass with the pads, perhaps. So I had a little bit of there, just the two pad sounds, and one was the Moog Matriarch, which is quite interesting because it's not actually polyphonic, it's what's called paraphonic. What that means is I can play up to 4 notes on it, but they all share the same filter and VCA, and it kind of, when you play chords, the way it changes the voicing can be semi-random in a way. But the two pad sounds with the bass kind of sound quite flat on their own, but once Markus's loop's there, the two things I think are a greater sum of their parts, if you know what I mean. And then quite late on in the project, one of the things Markus did was send me a texture. He sent me hours of this stuff. I don't know how he did it all. It was all this playing we did with unusual things. Maybe you can interject here, Markus, and explain a little.
Yeah, let me explain that. I'm actually using a pedal board that's called Helix by a company called Line 6, and they had asked me to contribute new patches to a software update that they were going to do. I think that was maybe in September or August, and so they approached me in June or July, I can't remember now. And so this new they gave me the update before it was released, and so I was sort of a beta tester, and they had this new plugins in there, one of which was a glitch delay, right? So, and like me being me, the glitch delay not being glitchy enough, what I did is I assigned the parameters of the glitch delay to the volume pedal or to the expression pedal on the pedal board. So and then I created this, this basically one patch in the pedal board that gives me these really complex, evolving, always changing digital and kind of grating soundscapes, right? And so it was like done on purpose that it's very glitchy, and there were a lot of clicks in there which I then later removed with a audio restoration tool. But so the idea was to sort of like have this extra texture that is kind of like, as I said before, like adding these more chaotic overtones and also some sort of like chaotic movement to the sort of like, nothing we've done here is static, but kind of, you know what I mean? Like I wanted to have like really like short loops that sort of kind of interact with the calmness and the grandeur of the piece. And so yeah, maybe you can kind of like solo those tracks so people hear what they're like. It's
often when I mix things, it's not just me, I think most people who mix, you think there's lots of things you think about, of course, but one is the layers of the tones, the textures from bass. I already talked about the Moog bass there. When I first heard Markus's loop, it's not a fault of the loop is the loop. I automatically thought of bass because that's right down, lays the foundation, especially Moog bass. Whether you like it or not, Moog bass just has a certain weight that can just ground a track. Then Markus's loop and my pads are kind of mid-range. Some of the pads are a little bit higher, but we didn't really have any really top-end little sparkles. And the great thing about the sparkly kind of textures when you mix these is these really high sparkly textures, you can mix them quiet, really quiet, and they'll still come through. The way the human ear hears things is a very non-linear way, and really high sounds can be incredibly quiet and still sound quite clear. That's why in an orchestra, the guy who's got the triangle at the back. Even when the orchestra is going full flat out, he hits the triangle. You can still hear it. It somehow somehow cuts through the whole thing. So let me just play Markus's textures. Now he sent me more than we probably needed to have, although maybe he will argue this. And I basically cut it into bits. I just listened through and literally improvised which bits I would use and which bits I wouldn't. Just by ear.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think. There's 2 or 3 layers down here. All sorts of crazy. So again, it's kind of stuff. It's kind of grist for the mill. Mm-hmm. Trick is though when you add it all together. The opening section should sound like, sorry, it's a little inelegant having to move my screen to the right each time, or left, I beg your pardon, and then it should all play it together now. The correct section. Sorry about that. We need to go here. So I think you'll agree it is it's a massive sound, because you've got sounds from the very, very bottom bass of the Moog, through all of Markus's evolving soundscapes, through my fairly straightforward pad sounds, but which just work, to these tinkly, zingy, crazy things that dip in and out. Sometimes you hear them. If you listen to it on hi-fi speakers, you'll get a slightly different experience than if you listen on headphones. You'll probably hear them a little bit more clear on headphones. And I think all those elements together add to the grandeur of this piece. And when we came to name the tracks, which is sometimes the hardest thing, Citadel was what we called this, and it just seemed to fit this huge slab. The journey of what we're about to go through. Maybe you're starting somewhere you're not comfortable with, and a Citadel has this feeling of a vast space, a vast collection of individuals that has a grand feel, but slightly unsettling at the same time. Okay, it does morph into a slightly different section before the middle section, and this is where the Ons Martineau first comes in, and it's a combination of, I think, almost like a bass guitar that you played. It's a bass,
yes,
certainly.
Yeah.
You've got the guitar there, do you?
Yeah, it was. I mean, all the soundscapey bits and the these bass parts in the next section, they were played on this Touch Guitars T8 guitar. And I'll also have the other guitar for the more acoustic sounding pieces later. But yeah, so maybe Ian, just show us what the Ons Martineau, maybe just with the bass, sounds like there in the second section.
Yeah, so we have the Ons Martineau here. I use tape echo. I'd used tape echo quite a lot. I recently, or a few months ago, you know, when you've got a bit of gear and you shouldn't sell it. I used to have a Roland Space Echo. That was the top of the range, the RE501 that I bought in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, I was a bit short of cash and digital delays were coming in. The ethnic delay, which Markus loves. And I sold it, and I regretted it to a few months ago. I shouldn't have sold the tape echo because it just has a certain feel. Don't let plug-in manufacturers tell you they can sound it. They get close, but it's still not quite the same as a real tape echo. It has a certain charm. So I use tape echo quite a lot on this. So here's the Ons Martineau, I think, just on its own for starters. A bit of reverb there as well, or quite a lot of reverb. But I'll add the tape echo and then Markus's bass. And again, that was I just improvised the on Martino based on Marcus's bass part, and then it's part of the same track, but it's almost like a pause before the second track starts. The tune that I play on the Ons Martino is based on the theme at the start, but it's kind of like a pause, and I think it's a nice combination. That bass part, again, it's thinking of layers of sound. The bass is down here. It's not the Moog bass this time. It's Marcus playing the bass guitar, or the bass end of his touch guitar, and then the Ons Martino is obviously quite high, and the tape echo just adds a lovely, fluttery, gorgeous kind of bloom of echoes. Because every time the tape echo, there's splice in the tape. Every time it goes through the heads, it actually goes, and you actually hear the pitch change at that point. So it's like a kind of, it's very imperfect, but sometimes for this kind of thing, that's what it sounds nice, very organic.
You see, also for the bass parts, I use this glitchy delay treatment for this patch from the Helix that actually I submitted to the guys at Line 6 to use but they actually didn't use these these glitchy sounds. But anyway, like I think it worked very well here, because like there's this, what I find like this, and I think what we do very well is we sort of like combine sounds to create one new sound. So it's literally synthesis, right, of elements, right?
Well,
and in usual music production, for pop music and stuff, you would kind of like always try to separate elements, right? And here, what we do, we integrate them, and I really love that. And that's also why something like having glitchy delay and like bad edits, like it would almost sound like bad edits in the bass track, kind of works, because it just becomes part of the overall texture.
it's part of the organic feel as well. It's you have to be a little careful with synthesizers. When you're using sequences, you can get this repetitive feel, and of course, if that's what you want, that can be great. Kraftwerk made a 50-year career on repetitive loops. It was great. It's wonderful. But for the kind of music we're doing, we're after a much more organic feel. So you've got Marcus playing this bass parts with his glitchy treatments. You've got me playing the Ons Martino. It just has this lovely organic feel. It just kind of never really repeats. Even if I play the same notes on the Ons Martino, I won't play them the same twice, because there's so much parameters involved, so many different things I can change. So maybe we'll go into the middle section now. So what I should probably try to figure out is where Marcus's loop is. I think it's this one here. We've called it F minor clouds. I think this is it.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite quiet. I might need to put this. It's quite quiet there, so I'll try to put it. What, did it come through loud enough?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a beautiful. This is more of a beautiful soundscape, and one of the first things I did was, as I mentioned before, to put this through the Roland System 100M to chop it up. So I'll try to figure out. I've got names for these things, so hopefully I can figure out. Here is F minor clouds chopped, and there is. So it's now sounding like this. So you'll probably hear that if you're listening in stereo. You'll hear this constant. They never play at the same time, and there's never a gap in the pulse. So it's a coin flip, and it's a totally it can be heads or tails. It can be left or right. And then I added tape echo to that. So I'll play this with the tape echo. And I think we've used this a few times. I think even on our Distant Rituals, there was one track which used this. And it's got a lovely organic sound of the System 100M. So this kind of does its thing. And then...
Hey, Ian, let me just add one thing, which is probably something that is important. Like the way that I set up these soundscapes that you then cut up here is that within them, there is some sort of tonal variation. And there's some sort of like slow moving chord sequence, right? So like, you know, we don't need to do that now, but if you were just listening to that track, like the cut up track, you would still hear some harmonic movement, like the potential root notes change. And I think that adds to the organic feel of the whole thing.
It does, yes. It's the sound is, there's a pulse to the sound, but the left and right changes all the time. But then Markus's loop, which is being chopped up, you can hear the notes, but it just seems to drift. So every pulse is different. It's not like just programming an oscillator on a synth where it would kind of be the same. Every single chopped up pulse is different, even though the overall rhythm has a feel. What I'll start to do now is I started to add sequence lines to this, but I didn't want the sequence lines to dominate. I didn't want them to be on the top. I didn't want to go for the Berlin School full-on sequencer kind of thing. I wanted the sequences to be more of a textural thing. And there's different layers here. If you look here, there's Moog bass. Well, there's two lots of Moog bass, but there's Moog bass over here, which I think I just worked out a sequence, and that kind of changes throughout. There's then Moog arps, arpeggios, and then my favorite, the surge arpeggios. The surge, which I'll add last, it has, that's the big thing there in the wooden cabinet. It has this lovely oscillator, which is a variable waveform oscillator. It can go from sine wave to triangle wave to square wave to pulse wave, and you can control voltage that. And what I do, I set up control voltage sequences to actually change that in a rhythm, but I'll often set those up to be 6 steps long over like a 4/4 pulse. I mean, this is kind of not got a time. This isn't really not got a timing signature, but it's kind of 4/4. It's got a definite pulse, but it's not an obvious 4/4. But I'll often set the length of the control voltage sequencer that's changing the waveform on the surge to not be the same length as the time signature bar length, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. So I'll add these things now, one by one. They have a love. They come in and out. The arpeggio on the Moog matriarch and the surge. There's various filters going on, and they're coming in and out. And the interaction, and they're not coming in and out. This is going to come in and out in 2 bars and then go out for 2 bars. I use a lot of LFOs and non-synchronous LFOs, and what I mean by that is the LFOs aren't clocked and they're not in sync. So basically, the ins and outs of the various layers change all the time. Sometimes they'll both be in, sometimes they'll both be out, but quite a lot of the time you have mixtures of the two. And again, it's all about this. It's repetitive, but it's not. I quite often talk about this idea when you look at a stream, it kind of always looks the same, but it's not. If you really look at it, it's changing all the time. It's never quite the same twice. And I often try to get these kind of things happening in these textures and layers. I think then what I added was some drums, but they're kind of not drums. I didn't want to have a boom, boom, boom kind of drum. So it's textured stuff. I don't think there's actually any bass drum on this. It's we've got phased hats, and what it is, it's the System 100M where I use white noise chiff, little chiff sounds, kind of like hi hats, but there's a left and right thing going on again, and then I'm using the phasers on the 100M, which are some of the most beautiful phasers I've ever heard. I use them a lot. I often put instruments through the System 100M. They're not the quietest phasers, but sometimes with a phaser you don't want the signal to be ultra quiet because even the background noise gets phased in a nice way. So you'll see when I add the phased hi-hats how that kind of just pushes the rhythm along a bit. And those hi-hats were a performance. I listened while I was recording this, and I'm opening up the envelopes by hand. It wasn't a sequence. I'm actually increasing the decay time on the envelopes and slightly opening the filters by hand. So at certain points, the hi-hats have a slight crescendo to them, then they get pulled back again. And you can really only do that as a performance because it has to be organic. It has to follow what the rest of the track is doing. Then there's two other elements really to this. There's more of the textures that Markus did, which I think in the middle section are pulled out. I'll just double check that.
Yeah, they're turned down. Yeah,
I've got the waveforms very squashed up on the screen, so I've got volume. Automated volume fades to fade these in and out. So even though Markus took all the trouble to record all this, I didn't put it in. And the reason I didn't put it in is because we wanted a guitar solo, and those textures would have interfered with the guitar solo. The guitar solo needs to be the focus of this part of the track. So all this talk so far about this track, the chopped up loops, the hi-hats, the different sequences, the bass, they're all there as a backing for Markus to play over the top. And the idea was Markus will play his solo, but the backing has a pulse, but it has this constant organic change to it. And I'll just play this now with a couple of the beautiful theme that Markus came up with at the beginning, which kind of wasn't there at the beginning, if you know what I mean. When I was hearing the original loop and doing my parts, I didn't know Markus was going to do this theme, but it's a gorgeous theme. It just works so well. I just need to go through all this and unsolo everything. I don't know whether Ableton Live has an unsolo all option. It would be
command and click.
Is it?
Yeah, command and click on solo.
Look at that. You learned something new. Anyhow, here's Markus's guitar solo. It's beautiful, Markus. It's just such a lovely. I could listen to that for hours. I really could. It's a beautiful guitar sound. It's obviously a guitar, but it's not your regular kind of guitar sound. If you know what I mean. It's not a Strat. Not that there's anything wrong with Strat, but So,
Yeah, you know, Ian, it's I wouldn't really call this a solo. Obviously, it's the lead part here, but really what I was trying to do, because I was reacting to your bass part, right? So the bass part was there before I played this.
yeah.
So the idea was to kind of like take this and I quite like folkloristic music, and like and so the idea was to give this sort of like this beautiful earthy kind of like melody that kind of like pulls everything together. And then at the end of this little section here with this theme, then kind of like starts what I would consider more of a solo, where it kind of like then just goes.
Cool. So should we go to the last section?
Sure.
There's a long kind of a segue, and we get to this point here. So let me play you Marcus's loop first, which I think is F minor dark undertones. The undertones a band? Never mind. So I think we were talking about this before. It has, at one and the same time, a restful beauty to it, yet a slightly unsettling feel. And there's these kind of reverse things you're doing as well, aren't there? There's like reversed notes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I had to puzzle over this for a little bit more, and I didn't feel it needed sequence lines. And I thought, for my part, sometimes when you work with another person, you sometimes just need to step back a bit. It's not all about look at me all the time. You just need to support what the other person is doing. And I saw this particular section of the album that I would do that. I would just step back and I would do some textures just to give the layers a little bit more interest. Well, not interest, not the right word. I would add textures which I thought added to the feel, but really that strange loop, and then what I'll show you at the end, what Marcus added to that, that's really the foreground, and I'm in the background. I think that's an important part when you work with someone, is sometimes if you don't need to say that much, you can just step back. Would you agree, Marcus?
Yeah, and like this the reason why I called my initial loop there with dark undertones is because, like as I said before, like sometimes the bass end is kind of like treated very in a very simplified way, right? And what we're doing here is interesting. Like we have this pretty like clear harmonic texture on top, and then at the bottom there is this strange pitch shifter interval, which is the undertone, right? Which I call undertone here, which is sort of dissonant. So here in this part of the album, things kind of flip around a little bit, where before like everything was built on the foundation and going up, and here's a little bit that the more colorful parts are kind of like happening underneath, and then the little bit of a guitar solo that I guess you will also demonstrate.
Yeah. In a moment. This is why I didn't want to put any bass on here. Wouldn't work me bass on. So there's a couple of layers of textures, just some effects here on the synths. So you can see they're just little textures. It's not about a grand showcase. It's just that little details. And then Marcus has some of his glitchy textures down here. I think I can't remember if they're in at this point in time. Let me just double check. They're very quiet at that point. So it was command and click, eh? Excellent. Look at that. So then Marcus added at the last stage these two. They're almost acoustic guitar sounding parts.
Yeah, it's this touch guitar, which is a hollow body, and it has a piezo pickups here, so it really does sound like an acoustic guitar.
Yeah, I'll play this with the whole this first section with everything in. So yeah, it has this again. You're accentuating this pastoral. It's a beautiful day kind of feel, but hold on, there's something strange in the cornfield, kind of vibe, bit of an unsettling kind of thing. So yeah, and then it kind of. I'll not play the end sound effect. I won't give away. There's a strange, weird sound comes in at the end. Some sound effects which kind of obliterate across all this, which ends to the end of the first side. And then, of course, you've got to get up with it on vinyl and turn it over. On CD, it's the same in terms of you haven't got to turn the CD over, but there's a 2 or 3 second gap between the end of the first suite and the second suite. So you almost get exactly the same experience on the CD as you would in turn the vinyl over. So what I think I should do now is load up the next song. This may take a few seconds because it does take a lot of, even on my new Mac here, a lot of processing power. And do I want to save? No, I don't. And let us just wait while the spinning beach ball of doom just does its thing, and hopefully it'll load up. So I really like this idea of a continuous suite of music on a vinyl record. It's quite interesting when you send it off to the pressing plant, of course, because when you master a CD, even a continuous piece of audio, you put in track IDs, invisible track IDs, so your CD player can actually skip tracks. Of course, on a continuous suite of music, even though there's 3 tracks, the vinyl is still a continuous groove, and there's no way of knowing actually when the second or third track starts. So you can probably guess because it kind of changes pattern on the grooves, but it does have the length of the times on the tracks on the back of the vinyl record. So we're at the beginning of side 2 now, and let me find Marcus's thing, which is F ambiguous. Perhaps, Marcus, you can describe why it's ambiguous before I play it.
Well, it just means that it's a combination of modes. So it's not a simple 7-note scale. Uses more notes than 7.
Oh, there's more notes than 7? Wow.
Well, yeah.
Let me play just this then. Again, a very mysterious sound in the first thing. I thought it was bass. Similar to Citadel, it had a similar genesis, this track, but I think it goes to a different place. So when I add the bass, again, I used Ableton Live for me to figure out what the basic notes were, so I could add the bass. And then I'm going to do it in a different order than what you actually recorded, because I think there's a Nons Martin part in here, which I'll add last. because there's a lot of Markus's glitchy textures in this, is quite a crazy. It's almost a morass of sound, which is just kind of there in the background, and you're not quite sure what it is.
Can you just solo the glitchy guitars, maybe? So you can hear that they're quite chromatic, like they're not even like trying to be in the key. So they add these ever-changing harmonics.
It's when I first heard some of these textures, I was like, oh, what? I was actually quite not surprised is not the right word. I wasn't sure what to do with them. It was like I listened through a few times and I was like, you kind of surprised me, and I mean that in a good way. It's not what I would never have done what Markus did here, which is great. Of course, you're going to work with somebody else. You want them to surprise you. But the more I listen to it, and especially with the full mix, it just, again, it has this, from the very low to the very high. It fills up the field. It fills up the sound stage. And when you fill up the soundstage like that, it does have an effect. It has quite a psychological or an emotional effect. It's quite heavy in a way, and not necessarily heavy in a heavy metal way, but it kind of just weighs down on you, because everything is, all your frequency responses are full. When you have a more lightweight track, which we'll hear at the end, you often have bits missing. There might not be bass, or there might not be top end. You're more a restricted sonic palette, and that can give it more of an open feel. But this has quite a claustrophobic feel. And the more, when I started to play Markus's glitchy textures back, it accentuated this. Well, the track's called Brood, so it's a brooding, claustrophobic, something not so nice is going to happen kind of vibe. So I'll play the Ons Martino track. Which I guess I can, did that work? Did that unclick everything? It has. I'll play just the Ons Martino, and in fact there's 3 layers of Ons Martino here, including tape echo. Just that last note there, you could hear the gliss that I can do. It's not the same as pitch bend, and that's me actually purposefully running the ring, and it's actually going through. It's going through all the infinite notes in between the notes. It's a completely smooth analog pitch glide, and of course it'll go through some of the notes that aren't in the scale. It's not going from this note to that note to that. It's a completely smooth transition, and there's lots of echo and tape echo and reverb to give this huge bloom. And I'm not using the Ons Martino here as a solo instrument. It's buried quite deep in the mix, and you don't hear every note really loud, but sometimes it just pokes out, and there's a very long echo on it. So when some of these pitch bends, you'll hear, especially on headphones, you'll hear the echo going away into the distance within this massive block of sound. Let me just put everything on at once. those high-pitched notes on the Ons Morton, particularly, you can hear the delay. But Marcus was talking before about the sounds of they basically coalesce into this slab. It's basically one sound, albeit we've added these different sections, but it behaves like one sound, like this huge slab of sound. And I think that's, from a dramatic point of view, quite an emotional thing. It's not so easy to pick out the different parts of the sound. It almost behaves like a single entity.
Exactly, and it also does that in terms of the mere composition of the parts, right? Like you would, like the progression that we're hearing, like the blooming of certain sections and stuff, is coming from the combination of all the elements. It's not just one element that does that. It is really it emerges, like the progression emerges from the sonic elements. And it's
Yes.
not planned, right?
It wasn't planned like that at the start, because obviously it's a lot of this happens in the mix as well. I think with a track like this, because I had to sculpt your glitches to go up and down in volume. I had to sculpt the level of the Ons Martin. I use a lot of compression on the Ons Martin. I didn't particularly want any one note to poke out. There's a couple of the higher notes, because the higher notes you can hear more. But I'm using a lot of compression on things at times on a track like this, just to squash it into one sound. Okay, we come into the second section, which is in a way a mirror image of the first side. I'll play Marcus's loop, which is called F major clouds. No, that's the chopped loop. I'm not sure if what I did. Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. What I did with this loop was a little different, and that is I almost subconsciously identified the loop within the loop that I looped, which is this section here. Seems a little quiet there. Might be fading out, but I duplicated the notes that Marcus is playing with a pad sound. I think the two together sound a bit like this. You can hear the pad sound. I think the pad sound fades in as Marcus's looped section fades out. But I kind of heard a melody within this section. I mean, the loop's a really long loop. I'm just cutting out maybe 16 bars or so here. Then I've got the chopped up 100M. Now, I'm not using the phasers on the 100M here. There's flanges on as well. It's a stereo flanger. When I say stereo, it's two mono flanges, and the left and right ears have got a different flange. Now, one of the flanges has a slight fault because it's like 30, 40 year old is. And I tried always to EQ it out, but eventually I quite liked it because it's almost like a very, very soft percussion sound. On my headphones, it sounds more on the right, and it's more just a case of once every either 1 bar, 2 bars, it just kind of goes. It's a very like a whisper, and if you hear, I'll put it on again. hear that okay? It's just this. And I just thought, actually, I'll leave it in. It's quite nice. It almost sounds like the softest of softest percussion sounds with a long decay on it. So sometimes malfunctions on gear can lead to interesting things that you might not have done otherwise. Then I added bass parts and percussion, again the hi-hats. So we'll add those in. Now the bass start part there is dangerously getting close to a Berlin sequencer at times. I had written a very simple bass part, and sometimes you think that's okay, that's fine. But Markus actually went, no, it's too much the same. You need to change it more. You need to put variations in on this, and the best way is to hand play these things. And then I kind of quantized it because it fitted this feel. So the bass actually continuously changes. It gets kind of faster, then it gets slower, then it gets a little bit more complicated, and then it gets more faster at the end. And when everything's playing, you're not really that aware of the bass. It's not a really loud bass, but sometimes when things change like that, I think they add to the subliminal enjoyment of the piece, because it does change without you necessarily being aware of the thing being in the foreground. Then I added some more Moog arpeggios and surge with tape echo. I'll add those. First the Moog arps from the Matriarch, and then the lovely surge. The kind of crescendo there a bit, but it's very much again in the background most of the time. And the sequences, the surge arpeggio and the matriarch arpeggio and the surge sequence, I don't think they're quite the same length. There's different things going on with the modulation. So again, it's this patterns change, which change, and there's layers of things going on. And then lastly is Markus's guitar solo. I'll play more of the solo this time. So Command, click, and we have. Layers. One thing I'll say about this is I don't even know what genre music that is. It crosses so many things. It's kind of the guitar kind of is it prog? Is it Berlin school? Is it electronic? Is it EDM? It's one of those things. I'm not even quite sure what genre you would call that, other than the Markus and Ian genre. I don't know what you feel about that, Markus.
I agree with you. I wouldn't know.
It's There's my influences in there with the Berlin School kind of bass and the sequence lines. There's part of them, obviously, Markus does lots of things, of course, but that touch guitar solo, the kind of slightly prog side of things, it's a lovely blending of genres, and I think it's a good thing to go beyond strict pigeonholes. So the last track, which is very simple, you'll see there's not a lot here, a little bit of texture. Markus's loop, this was it, F major. So it's beautiful. It really is fantastic. I was very inspired by this. It's a very simple piece. There's only Markus's guitar loop, which I haven't chopped or in any way. One thing I did do was I wanted to have a pad or string sound that just hung in the air, like a vapor, like mist. I didn't want it to even be able to. It's just there, and I used the Ableton algorithm to tell me what pitches, and there was loads of pitches. There was so many pitches, you can imagine that complicated. Well, not complicated, but all the echoes on Markus' guitar, it detected all those, and it just does this. It just hangs, and I mean, when I play it on its own, you can kind of hear some of the notes, but when it's behind Markus's guitar, and it doesn't need to be behind the guitar, it just provides this wash of tone, which is very warm. It's the kind of thing you don't notice it almost until you take it out. And then this Hans Martin solo, which we talked about before, which was one of those fun. It's a magical moment in time when you can hear another musician play something and you just respond to it like that. It doesn't happen that often, at least not to me. But when it happens, the hairs on the back of your neck really do stand up one end, and it's like, where did that come from? And you'll never know. It just did. Yeah. There it is. That's all the 6 tracks, I guess.
Yeah, wonderful, Ian. Thank you very much for showing this to us.
No worries.
You know, I guess it's sort of like, to most of the listeners, all of this is really a secret, you know, a secret world of like, how do they do these things, right? So I'm really I think it's great that we're sharing this.
Should I stop sharing my screen now so you can see my?
Yeah. So we can see your face.
Hello.
Wonderful. Yeah. So Ian, thank you very much for, over 2 decades of friendship and, music making, and really home, this last track of the new album Outland is really almost like, it really is home. I have goosebumps right now, and it's thank you so much.
Without exaggeration, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. Let alone that fact that we played it. I have to pinch myself sometimes, and you can't analyze it. You just have to be grateful that happened at that point in time.
Yes. Yeah. So let's leave it at that. I think this was beautiful. Thanks so much, Ian. And if people want to buy the album, we appreciate that. Obviously, we have also the vinyl edition, which is very beautiful. And like your partner, girlfriend, Wendy, she did the artwork, which has been very well received.
Are you able to share the link to the Bandcamp page, or did you?
Yeah, we already did.
All right, brilliant.
And yeah. So thanks very much, everybody. And I hope also that if you haven't done so, go to my website and sign up to my mailing list, so you'll get future announcements of events. I'm doing workshops and these kinds of meetings. So I hope to see you again at some point. And Ian, I'll talk to you in the next few days anyway.
All right, cheers.
Yeah, we can take questions. Like, we have like maybe 5-10 minutes.
Sure.
Like, I don't know who asked that. Feel free. Like, if you have a question, go for it.
No, it's just a comment that I put in the chat earlier about the Agnès Martineau. Johnny Greenwood feels that instrument, and I wondered about Ian's thoughts on this, is the closest to the human voice in its characteristics, which is what drew him to that instrument, because one of the instruments he always wished he had was the ability to sing, and he can't sing. But the Agnès Martineau gives him the characteristics of the voice. What are your thoughts on that from your experience with the instrument?
It can be extremely close. I mean, as I said, I use it with a modular synthesizer, so I don't actually have an Agnès Martineau. The French Connection is a modern CV Gate version of that, but it's the playing technique. I can get any sound. Most of the sounds I'm using on this album are quite pure, and that does, when you use pure sounds, it does sound a little bit like a human voice. It's just the expression. I can affect everything about the sound, the pitch, the slides. I don't always slide between notes. You choose where you slide, and when I say you choose where you slide, I don't mean I'm sitting there going, not now, not. It's totally instinctive. The vibrato, I add the vibrato, the speed of the vibrato, I change that, the volume. I mean, the rocker switch on this, it's not just changing the volume of the sound. I also have it patched into the filter cutoff, so the timbre of the sound is going to change. So the further I push that rocker switch down, not only does it get more loud, but the tone gets more of a bright sound. And I usually have it patched to one of the thing. In fact, most of the time, my little voice I just use as the make noise or coast. That little small thing that make noise you make, and I just have it sitting on the top of the Agnès Martineau, and I patch it in, and it's a total joy to play. I never get tired of playing it. So thanks to Johnny Greenwood, of course, for pushing Analog Systems to make that. So it's wonderful. Thanks for the question.
If anybody wants to ask any more questions, but like I feel like, in a way, then this is sort of like, and I'm not talking about like these, but all, like, a lot of questions have been answered even to me simply by listening. to what we did, Ian. Like it's really interesting. Like to me, obviously, like I know about the technical details of this, but emotionally, let's say, or creatively,
Emotion is the most important thing. You can imagine with the kind of gear that I use, I get asked a lot of questions about the gear. In fact, I've been typing out answers to a written interview today. And what I will always stress is the gear isn't that important. I mean, yes, look, I've got some lovely, and of course, it's wonderful. It's the emotional, the music is the most important thing. You have to have something musically relevant to say. And if you don't, it's kind of then just sound design. These instruments, complicated though they are, and cool though they are, and wonderful though they look, the music is always, for me, the most important thing.
Yes. I agree. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, everyone. And hopefully see you again for some other event in this series. And enjoy the music. Enjoy Outland.
See you later. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.